is such an interesting book that I want to continue with it. And I'm going to start by reading the same text that I read to you 2 weeks ago. Daniel chapter 2, 19 through 23 says, "Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings, and he setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter." And we're going to talk about this very event tonight in chapter 2. Now, we ended with chapter 1 2 weeks ago, so I'm going to give you a short review of chapter 1 just to catch you up. But we covered the entire chapter of the chapter 1 of Daniel. Daniel's an exciting but small book. There's only 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and if you've never read the book of Daniel, I would encourage you to take a read. It's very exciting. It'll encourage you. It'll make you to want to live for God no matter what. And the book of Daniel takes place roughly 2,600 years ago. But even so much of it is relevant yet today. In fact, Daniel 1 and 2 starts out, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." Now, it was talking about King Nebuchadnezzar. That was the pagan, evil king of the Babylonian Empire. And the Bible says the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Now you might, and it says, "And with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." So Nebuchadnezzar, when he destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, he took a lot of those treasures out of the temple back to Babylon and put them in the house of his God. That's like a real slap in the face, exactly. Something else came into mind. I'm glad you said that. King Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege on Jerusalem. He would eventually conquer and destroy Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah on his third attack. Now, this conquering of Jerusalem took more than just, overnight. It was like multiple years in the process. There were 3 separate attacks that Nebuchadnezzar made on Jerusalem before the final and third one where he just destroyed everything, laid it to waste. Now, I understand the Babylonian Empire was the power player in the world at this time, and the kingdom of Judah was just a tiny kingdom by comparison. But the Bible says the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. So no matter how bad the situation looks, no matter how small you look in the face of your enemies, understand that God is still in control. God allowed this to happen. But you might ask, why? Why would God allow this to happen to his chosen people? Well, you have to go clear back to the days of Moses to understand this. God had made a covenant with his chosen people clear back in the time of Moses when they were slaves in Egypt and God brought them out of Egypt. I think they were in Egypt for more than 400 years. That's all they knew. And Moses led them through the wilderness, through the Red Sea, and we all know the story of Moses and how they wandered for 40 years. And then there was the 10 commandments that God gave Moses. And one of those commandments was, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." But despite being strictly warned not to do so, the Israelites just couldn't help themselves. They continually fell into idolatry. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They saw many miracles. Moses led them during that 40-year period, but he died, and Joshua took over, and it was Joshua that took the Israelites over into the promised land. And when they got into the promised land, they realized that there were other people that were inhabiting the promised land. All right, they were called the Canaanites. Now, the Canaanites, the gods that these Canaanite people worshipped were just too salacious for the Israelites to ignore. And Jeff, if you could put my slide up, the one that's the Canaanite god slide. Baal and Asherah. These were the two primary gods of the Canaanite people. Now, Baal was considered the weather god. In fact, that picture of him on the left there, he's holding actually a lightning bolt in one hand and a sword in the other. But they considered him the weather god. You see, the Canaanite land was a very fertile land. This was the promised land that God was going to give to his people. And it was unlike anything they'd ever experienced before. Remember, they were in Egypt for 400 years, and Egypt's a very dry, desert-like area. And then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and the Israelites were pretty much sheep and goat herders. Okay, they weren't farmers so much. But when they got to Canaan and they saw how fertile the crops were, the Canaanites were a very agricultural-based society. They were farmers. And the reason they believed in the god of Baal was because he was considered the weather god. And they prayed to Baal because they counted on that rain, that good weather to make their crops grow. They were an agricultural people. But, the Israelites, they had never seen anything like this before. It was the land flowing with milk and honey. The fruits and vegetables were bigger than anything they'd ever seen grown in the land they were at. And they wondered to themselves, was their God able to lead them out of Egypt through the desert and provide them with the most fertile land they had ever seen before? Or should they possibly honor these gods of the Canaanites in addition to honoring the God of Israel? Because they didn't want to upset. If it's true that Baal provided the weather and the rain to make the crops grow, they didn't want to do anything to upset that. And then there was Asherah. Asherah was a female goddess. She was considered the fertility god. The Canaanites believed that the female goddess Asherah provided fertility not just for their own, reproduction of their own children, but for their crops, their livestock. Asherah was responsible for all of that. She's typically depicted as a pregnant female with prominent features. I won't go into detail there, but you can see from the pictures. The method in which she was worshipped was often through immoral sexual activity. That's how they worshipped this goddess, sometimes performing immoral sexual acts on the temple of Asherah. They had prostitutes there. And when you went there and messed around with these prostitutes, you were worshiping Asherah. That's what they believed. So you had Baal and Asherah competing with the one true God of Israel for his chosen people's attention. And these two false gods represented money, because if Baal didn't bring the rain to make the crops grow, then they didn't get the money they needed, because they were a very agricultural society. And if Asherah didn't produce the fertility, then they didn't have the reproduction of the animals and the people and the crops that they prayed for. So she was the god of sex. So you had the god of weather, which provided the income, and you had this god of Asherah who provided sex. So you basically had two false gods that represented money and sex. Now, aren't you glad that in modern civilization we've moved beyond worshiping the gods of money and sex? Aren't you glad that we've moved beyond that? Yeah, we haven't moved beyond that. We still worship the gods of money and sex today. And God commands, he was absolute in his command, no other gods before me. But the Israelites continued to worship multiple gods just to cover all the bases. And this angered God. So just like the word says, God gives the king of Judah into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar as punishment for his people. And we learned about Daniel 2 weeks ago, a young man of 16 or 17 years old. He lived a little more than 600 years prior to the birth of Jesus. He's taken in the first wave of exiles from Judah to Babylon. He enters the Babylonian school for the best and brightest young people for civil service for the king of Babylon. He's put in a new environment. He's given a new name. He's taught a new language. There's new gods in this new culture. Think about it. If another nation came to the United States, totally conquered and wiped out the United States, exiled us back to their nation, and we were in a brand new culture that worshiped different gods, had different things that they did, traditions, spoke a different language, gave you a new name, it might be hard to cling to what you were taught as you were growing up, especially as a 16 or 17-year-old kid. I could see where it might be very tempting to just give in, give up. But Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's meat, if you remember. He and his 3 fellow Jewish young friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, convinced the king's representatives to feed them pulse and water for 10 days. And during those 10 days, their countenance was healthier than the rest of the students that were in that school. Remember, they had to go through a 3-year school where they were trained in how to be the king's servants. And after that 10 days shown that they were healthier and fatter than the other students, they went ahead and allowed them to just eat the pulse and water for the remaining 3 years. And after 3 years, King Nebuchadnezzar is not only impressed with these 3 Hebrew children, or 4, but we end our lesson with the Bible stating that he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, astrologers that were already in his court. So you got to understand that Nebuchadnezzar himself was a young king. His father was Nebuchadnezzar, I hope I'm saying that right. He had died of old age, and Nebuchadnezzar was the oldest son of 3, I believe it was 3 sons Nebuchadnezzar had. And he took over, he inherited the throne. Fairly young himself, probably late 20s. So he's new to this, but he's inherited all his father's court of all these magicians and sorcerers and soothsayers. And not so sure that he trusted him that very much. So in my attempt to bring you up to speed to where I left off last time, we now begin chapter 2. So I want to go to Daniel 2, verses 1 through 5, and we'll go ahead and get started here. And I guess I'll start by saying, have you ever had a dream? You knew you had a dream, but when you woke up, you couldn't remember any of the details of it. It seems like that happens more in my older age. When I was young, I remember having dreams and waking up and being able to tell every detail about those dreams. But now I dream and I wake up and I know I had a dream, but I can't even remember what it was about. I know I'm not the only one. Other people have done that before. So Daniel 2, 1 through 5 says, "And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him." So he was waking up in the middle of the night, having these dreams that were bothering him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, "I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream." Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. Syriac was the language. "O king, live forever. Tell thy servants thy dream, and we will show thee the interpretation." And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut into pieces, and your house shall be made a dunghill." So if you're one of Nebuchadnezzar's wise men, you're having a bad day all of a sudden. The king has just told you not only do you have to interpret his dream, but you have to tell him what his dream was. And if you can't, you'll be cut into pieces. Now in Babylon, dreams were considered to be messages from the gods. Usually the wise men could come up with some sort of interpretation for a dream if they at least had some idea what the dream was about. They had put many generations of study into dreams. They had books that were written about dreams. They knew if you had this image in your dream, it usually represented this, and this image represented this. And they had books and libraries about all this stuff. So the wise men of Babylon, if a king told them, "I dreamt I saw an eagle grab a horse and fly off," then they could go look at their books and they could study that, and they could come back to the king with an interpretation of what that dream meant. So they had references for various things that would help them interpret these dreams. But Nebuchadnezzar, he's not playing by the rules this time. Twice the wise men implore the king, "Tell us the details of your dream, and we will provide you with an interpretation." But twice King Nebuchadnezzar emphatically claims they will not only provide him with an interpretation, but they will also provide him the details of his dream. Now, what King Nebuchadnezzar was asking here is humanly impossible. Wouldn't you agree? And his wise men know it's impossible. In fact, in Daniel 2, verse 10, it says, "The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, 'There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean.'" Verse 11, "And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." Now, some historians believe Nebuchadnezzar had either gone mad, or some believe he truly didn't forget his dream. He was just pretending like he forgot it because he had a distrust in his father's wise men, and he was going to put their skills to the test to see if they were really worth their mettle, if they were so in touch with the spirit world, if they were so in touch with their occultic practices, they should be able to tell him what he dreamed, not only the interpretation of it. Now, again, I don't know if that's the case or not. Possibly he truly did not know what he dreamt about. Now, while this demand seems impossible to the king's wise men, there was one wise man named Daniel who was not present at this particular moment. He served a God that specializes in the impossible. Now, we're going to face problems in our lives that seem impossible, right? But rather than panic, we need to remember that we serve a God who can make the impossible possible. The king's wise men were beginning to panic. They knew if they didn't figure out not only the interpretation of this dream, but the dream's details itself, they were going to be cut into pieces and their houses would become dung heaps. So these astrologers, these sorcerers, these Chaldeans were unable to persuade the king with any amount of logic that what he was asking for could not be done. And the Chaldeans, they admit their gods cannot help them. They said they do not dwell with flesh. Only the gods could do this, and they don't dwell with flesh. And of course their gods could not help. They didn't even exist. They were false gods. These wise men, they could manufacture interpretations for dreams, but they could not tell Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamt. And by answering that their gods' dwellings are not with flesh, they were betraying their own concept of their gods. Theirs was a hollow religion, a religion of convenience. They claimed to believe in their gods, but their belief made no difference in their conduct. They were essentially practical atheists. And we have folks like this today. They profess to believe in God, but their belief is hollow. They too are practical atheists. They don't listen to him or do what he says. It feels good to walk around and say, "Oh, I go to church," or "I'm a Christian," but when the metal meets the road, when the rubber meets the road, they don't really believe in that God. They don't put their faith and trust in that God. But you know, God does live among his people, and he wants to change our lives if we will just believe. So the king is very angry. He's wroth, and he determines to slaughter all the wise men, not just the ones that were in front of him saying that it couldn't be done. He decided, I'm going to destroy all the wise men. This includes Daniel and his 3 friends. And Daniel's not even there to defend himself. So Daniel learns of the king's decree, and he asks the captain of the king's guard why the king is acting so hastily with his decision. And the captain explains the situation to Daniel. You know, maybe the conversation went like this. Say, some of the wise men were mouthing off to the king, and now he wants to kill everybody. But Daniel, Daniel had a pretty good reputation. The first chapter said that Nebuchadnezzar talked with these students in this school, and he found Daniel and his 3 friends to be 10 times better than all the other wise men that were on his father's court. So he had a little bit of a reputation with King Nebuchadnezzar. So verse 16 and 18 says, Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Now Daniel's going out on faith here. He doesn't know that the king dreamt. And the king obviously obliged and gave him some time. Verse 17 goes on to say, Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. You see, Daniel was at a crisis point. We've been there before too. We've been in crisis points where we don't know what to do. And notice how Daniel handles it. Imagine going to see a temperamental king who had just angrily ordered your death. Daniel did not shrink back in fear. He confidently approached the king, believing God would tell him all the king wanted to know. And after convincing the king to give him some time, he goes back home, gets his 3 friends, and they have a prayer meeting. They are entering into a serious prayer meeting. When we are in a tight spot, in an impossible situation, this is how we should handle it, just like Daniel did. We find some friends that we trust, that we can confide in. We share our problem with them, and we have a prayer meeting. Call out on the one true living God. Prayer is more effective than panic. Panic confirms your hopelessness. Prayer confirms your hope in the one true living God. Daniel's trust in God saved not only himself, but his friends and all the wise men of Babylon. I read verses 19 and 23 to open up this lesson, and I'm just going to capsulize instead of reading that again. But after the prayer meeting, God did reveal to Daniel in a night vision the details and the interpretation of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel goes on to worship and praise the God who can reveal the secret things. How do you feel when God answers your prayers? Do you rush off in excitement? Do you just jump up and down and go tell your friends, I got what I needed, I got my blessing from the Lord? Or do you take time to praise and worship the Almighty God? We need to learn to match our persistence in prayer with the same level of gratitude when God answers our prayer. God will give us the wisdom if we ask for it. Daniel asked God to reveal the secret to him. Now, you can spend $10,000 a year at Youngstown State University, and over 4 years and $40,000 later, you will get a degree that you can hang on your wall, a piece of paper that says you've been educated. But God provides wisdom freely to all who ask. James 1 and 5 says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him. Upbraideth not. In other words, he's not going to rebuke you for asking for wisdom. He'll give it to you freely. I want wisdom provided by God. It's far more valuable than any diploma on the wall. Church, we need to learn to pray for wisdom from God. We certainly need wisdom for this day and age. Just like Daniel was an exile in a foreign land, if you think about it, we're exiles in a foreign land as well. You know, our country has changed so much in the last 50 years. There was a time where the majority of families in America attended church at least once a week. When I was a kid, it wasn't uncommon to hear kids at school say, oh, Wednesday night's church service. Today, when you tell someone you go to church on a Wednesday night, they look at you like, I've never heard of that before. I knew people go to church on Sunday, but Wednesday? It's like people don't do that anymore. You know, there was a time when the Lord's Prayer was recited in schools and in our halls of government. There was a time when presidents and high-ranking officials would pray for our nation. But in 2021, our nation doesn't want to live by godly principles. They pretty much say, we don't want your God, we don't want your prayers, we don't want your Bible. We'd rather worship our gods of money and sex. But you know what? God is still in control. Evil kings may prosper, but God's word says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his. He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings, he setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. That's Daniel's blessing the Lord God for the secret he revealed to him. Let this knowledge give you confidence and peace no matter what happens in your life. And some pretty dark things can happen in our lives. But if we just remember that God is in control, he holds all the wisdom in his hand. Nothing happens without him letting it happen. So Daniel tells the captain of the king's guard not to slaughter the wise men and to let him go before the king so that he can interpret the dream. Now, verses 31 through 47, and there's 49 verses in chapter 2, contains a lot of reading, but basically Daniel proceeds to explain in great detail the aspect of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and then gives the interpretation thereof. So I'm going to have Jeff put up a slide, and I'm going to read verses 31 through 45, and you can kind of look at this graphic and get an idea of what Daniel's talking about. Verse 31 starts, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." Now, when we say terrible today, that's like a bad thing. But in the Bible, when they said terrible, that meant it was awesome. It was something great. Verse 32, "This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone was smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Verse 36, "This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength and glory. And whosoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee a ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold." So Nebuchadnezzar is probably feeling pretty good right now. Daniel just told him he was the head of gold on that magnificent image, and that he was a powerful ruler. "And after thee," but Daniel goes on in verse 39, "and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, forasmuch thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure." Daniel was very confident in what God had given him. Now I'm going to try to explain this graphic to you. You see this mighty image of this great warrior that King Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of. The head of gold represented Babylon. Babylon ruled from 605 to 539 BC and was eventually conquered by Persia. The breast and arms of silver represent Persia, which ruled from 539 BC clear to 168 BC. But even that great kingdom came down when it was destroyed by Greece. We've all heard of Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great conquered Persia and set up the great Medo-Greco kingdom. And it ruled from 331 to 168. I got my dates mixed up. Actually, Persia was from 539 to 331, and Greece was 331 to 168. And then the legs of iron, which the iron was the strong metal, it represented Rome. Rome ruled from BC 168 to AD 476. So you all remember when we heard about the birth of Christ And when Christ walked the earth, the Romans were ruling then. That was their empire. And they ruled clear till 476. Now, the Romans were never defeated or conquered by anyone. The Roman Empire just sort of fell apart. And when you talk about the feet of iron and clay in these divided nations, the Roman Empire, they controlled all of Europe at that time. And if you look at Europe now, it's just a collection of all these little nations. And some of the nations are stronger than the others. You got these small little nations, you got these great big nations, and they've all had their time. England had their time where they were strong, and France had their time when they were strong, and the different European countries have risen, but no one ever had a worldwide empire like what you had with Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. No one since then has had that kind of an empire. You've just had this collection of divided nations. But then we talk about the kingdom of Christ would come, which it did. The kingdom of Christ was set up when Christ walked the earth. And that kingdom started when Jesus died on the cross and was ascended back into heaven. And that kingdom continues today. And one day that kingdom will conquer all. And this was a great prophecy for the book of Daniel, which took place, hundreds of years before Jesus even came on the scene. In fact, critics of the Bible don't believe that Daniel was even written until long after, because there's no way he could have predicted all of this in a dream. That's what they believe. So notice how Daniel gives the interpretation. He's very humble. He gives all the credit to God. It would have been easy, it would have been tempting for Daniel to walk into the king, the most powerful man in the world, King Nebuchadnezzar, and say, I have the interpretation of your dream, and take all the credit for it. But he doesn't do that at all. He lets Nebuchadnezzar know there's a God in heaven who can show you your dream, and this is what it is. Imagine how King Nebuchadnezzar must have felt as Daniel tells him what he was thinking when he had laid down to sleep. He describes his dream in such perfect details and interprets them with great confidence that only the one true living God can grant. We should never hold back from sharing the miraculous works of our God. That's how people get drawn to the gospel. When they hear your testimony, they don't want to hear that you've made yourself who you are. But if you tell them, I'm where I am because God has blessed me. God has given me a good family. He's given me a good job. He's provided for me. He's given me good health. I thank the Lord for this. We give credit to the Lord for the blessings we have. Our testimony is what will win people to Christ. King Nebuchadnezzar responds by falling on his face and worshiping Daniel. He demanded that they should offer gifts and sweet odors to him. Daniel 2:47 says, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret. He knew that he just witnessed a miracle. The king goes on to award Daniel with many more gifts, makes him ruler of the entire province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. So that's the end of chapter 2, but the book of Daniel is not only a super interesting book, chocked full of prophecies and great exploits by men who put their full faith and trust in God, but it's rich with foreshadowings of the gospel. When the king's wise men said that what he was asking for was impossible. And they were right. It was impossible to man. They said that no man could answer that request, only the gods. But they said they don't make their dwelling among flesh. But if you go to John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And if you drop down to verse 14, it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, and the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Our God dwells among flesh. And he still dwells among flesh inside of us. We carry our God inside of us. I'm thankful for that today. Think about how the Israelites felt when their kingdom, their city, was destroyed by the Babylonians. Everything they knew was gone. All the great stories passed down through the ages. Chapter 1 says Nebuchadnezzar took part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, and placed them in the house of his God. This was like a great slap in the face to the nation of Israel. To the rest of the known world, the God of Israel looked like a loser. The children of Israel were probably questioning their own beliefs in the power of their God. Things, no doubt, were looking pretty bad for the Israelites. But we serve a God who knows all. We serve a God who knows all. He's always been in control. He still is in control and will remain in control forever and ever. While Nebuchadnezzar did his best to make the Israelites look like a defeated, small, insignificant group of people, God continually proves to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian people through the dreams and miracles and the commitment of his people that they were everything but that. Don't think that these things took place behind closed doors. You don't think that the fact that Daniel was able to interpret that dream through the mighty God of Israel, that didn't circulate throughout all of Babylon? That the exiled Israelites heard that and were like, they were probably excited, that it emboldened their faith to know that their God came through. You know, they heard about this. It strengthened their faith. They probably won a few Babylonians as well to the Israelite God. Even King Nebuchadnezzar had to acknowledge the supreme God of Israel. You know, we still serve that same all-knowing and powerful God today. Now, I'm done with my lesson, and I just want to take a few moments to worship that almighty, all-knowing God. If you need prayer in your body, please feel free to come forward. We will pray for you tonight. I'm going to ask Jess.